Hi everyone, Angela here. I'm using quilting cotton to make this fun pot holder. I'm using my 9.5-inch template with the silicone grips on the back to cut out 2 squares for the front and back. Cut another fabric square for the front contrast. Cut another square out of non-woven lightweight interfacing with the glue dots on one side. Another out of cotton batting. And also one out of heat-reflective Insul-Bright. This project was inspired by Alenka. I'll leave a link to her channel down below. For the binding, I'm using the contrast fabric and cutting a 2-inch strip along the crosswise grain. Cut away the selvage edges and then match the outer edges and press along the center. Open up and fold the outer edges towards the center, leaving about 1/8 of an inch gap. Once that's done, match the folded edges and press in half. Even though we didn't cut along the bias of the fabric, there's still a little bit of stretch. With right sides up, stack the 2 front pieces together. Find the center at the top and then draw a curvy line to the bottom. About the midpoint between the center and the edge, draw another wavy line and then repeat on the other side. Draw each line slightly different and then cut both layers from the bottom, leaving a tiny bit together at the top. With the glue side up, place one of the squares on top of the interfacing with the solid edge on the left side. Then place the other fabric with the solid edge at the top. This piece needs to be slightly in from the edge and up from the bottom. Lift up all the top strips and the second and bottom strip of the fabric underneath. Now carefully weave together, making sure that all the edges are connecting nice and tight. Once that's done, give it a good press and also press it on the back to make sure it's fused together. Have the back piece with wrong side up and then stack the Insul-Bright batting and front piece on top and then clip all around. I'm using a Brother NV50S sewing machine. The link for this and the tools I use are in the description below. I'm setting to a zigzag stitch with the length of 2.5 and the maximum width. Stitch each seam from the top, curving down to the bottom. Center your seam with the center mark on the presser foot as you're sewing. If you need to, use a walking foot and set your machine to a slower speed. If you're finding this video helpful, make sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on all notifications, and leave a comment below. Remove all the clips, and you can see it's got a cute patchwork feel to it with a nice quilted design on the back. Next, trim about 3/8 of an inch off each side. Zigzag all around the outer edges. This will flatten it out and make it easier to attach the binding. Open up your binding and then match the zigzag edge to the back edge of the binding. Fold it over and just make sure that the center crease of the binding is right on top of the edge. Pin through all the layers near the fold and then just check on the back to make sure you've pinned through the binding. Stretch it a little bit and continue pinning it along the edge. When you get to the corner, gently stretch it over and pin the next side. At the corner, lift one side of the binding right up, push in the other side to the top, and adjust the bottom edges so they meet, creating a mitered corner. Crease with your fingers and then repeat on the back in the opposite direction. If you want, you can give each side of the corner a press before clipping it in place. When you're back to the first corner, cut your binding 3.5 inches from the edge. Set your machine for a straight stitch. Fold the end of the binding with right sides together, matching the folded edges. Then stitch with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and finish. Trim each corner and then turn right side out and poke out the corner. Move this end out of the way before stitching the binding. Have the folded edge of the binding run along the inside edge of the presser foot. Use a tool like an awl or a point turner to help you keep the binding edge in place. At the corners, stitch just past the folded edge, have your needle down, lift the foot and pivot. When you get close to the end, trim the thread. Because this corner will have the most stress, backtack here, continue stitching the binding, and backtack to finish. Fold the strap onto the back and have the end about 1/4 inch past the end of the binding. We'll stitch across here in line with the stitching, and we'll start our stitching from the center of the binding and not from the edge. Stitch back and forth a few times between the edges of the binding. You now have a nice neat loop with a finished end, and all of the binding is caught on the back as well. Thanks again for watching. Make sure to check out my video up next. Hi everyone, Angela here. To make this pot holder, I'm using this waffle-weave tea towel that I've washed, dried, and pressed. Fold in half with wrong sides together and smooth it out. I'm using a 9.5 inch template to cut out 2 squares. You can cut them any size you like. Make sure not to include any of the hems of the tea towel when cutting out. Using chalk or a marking pen, find the center at the top and bottom and draw a line down the middle. Then do the same thing going across. We only need to mark this top piece. From those center lines, I'm drawing lines 2 inches on either side, up and down, and across. To put in between, I'm cutting out 1 piece of cotton batting. You can cut 2 pieces if you like, just use the top piece as a pattern to cut the same size. I'm also going to cut out 1 piece out of Insul-Bright thermal batting. This batting is heat resistant. Place the tea towel with wrong side up, and then with all the edges matching, layer the 2 battings and the piece with the markings on top. Carefully clip the layers together all around. I'm using a Brother NV50S sewing machine. The link for this and the tools I use can be found down in the description. Lengthen the stitch length to number 4. Carefully sew along the center line, there's no need to backtack, and use your fingers close to the foot to keep all the layers in place. You can also use a walking foot to do this. Sew the other 2 lines beside the center one, both starting from the top. If you're finding this video helpful, make sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on all notifications, and leave a comment below. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Now after sewing these first 3 lines, you can see that the fabric is pushed slightly to the bottom. So the other lines now, as you can see, look like they're on a curve. So I'm just going to steam away the chalk marks and remark those 3 lines so they're nice and straight. When you sew these next 3 lines, you may have to lift the presser foot from time to time and push the fabric in a little bit to keep it from pleating. Once you've finished sewing those 6 quilt lines, remove all the clips. From the outer quilt line on each side, draw a line 2 inches from it. I have a template with different curves on it. I'll be using the curve with the 2-inch radius. Mark the curve on 3 of the corners. If you don't have a template, you can just measure from this inner corner 2 inches in a few places. Next, starting from the straight corner, we'll stitch right on top of this line all around. Carefully trim all around about 1/4 inch from that stitch line. You can make it a little less than 1/4 inch, but don't make it wider. Turn the dial to number 8 for a zigzag stitch, and then set the length at number 3 and the width at number 6. Zigzag all around so that the outer edges are caught inside the stitch. Now this step is optional, but the zigzag really flattens the seam nicely, making it easier to add the binding. I'm just flipping it over to the side that I think looks nicer before adding the binding. I'm using 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape that I made myself. You can find my tutorial for that here. To start, cut the end straight across and open up. When clipping the tape in place, match the edge of the tape with the edge of the pot holder and then fold over. The center fold of the tape should be right in the middle of the edge. Carefully clip the bias tape in place, and when you're going around the corners, just stretch the tape enough so that the inner folds are flat. Just try to keep the bias tape even on both sides. When you get close to the end, clip close to the corner, then measure 4 inches from the edge and cut the binding. Fold in the end of the tape, then push in the center so that the outer corners won't stick out, and clip in place. Remove the clip close to the corner and move the end of the tape out of the way. With the presser foot up, lower the needle down so that it's just beside the folded edge of the bias tape, then lower the presser foot. Continue stitching with the edge of the tape inside the zigzag stitch. Just take note where the folded edge of the tape is in relation to the marks on your presser foot. Now, of course, you can use a straight stitch to attach the binding, but the zigzag stitch is very forgiving and there's less chance of the binding coming away from the edge of the pot holder. When you get close to the end, reposition the bias tape and clip close to the corner. Continue stitching until you get to this edge. Raise your needle and then change back to a straight stitch. We now want to edge stitch the binding together. Lift the presser foot and just shift the pot holder to the left a tiny bit. Back tack, edge stitch right to the end of the tape and back tack to finish. There's no need to stitch across the end. Fold the end of the tape to the back so that the end is about 1/4 inch past this edge. We'll stitch a line here and start your stitching in the center of the binding and not from the edge. Hold the binding securely and back tack well at each end. So the zigzag should look pretty even on both sides, and as I mentioned before, it's pretty forgiving, so even if you don't stitch it perfectly, both of the folded edges should be caught inside the stitching. The loop is nice and neat, and I love the feel of the waffle weave in my hand. It just feels like it has a better grip. This finished pot holder measures about 9 inches square, and it would make a great gift along with one of my hanging tea towel designs or a bowl cozy. You can find those videos up next. Hi everyone, Angela here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this cute little pot holder with a heart in the center and binding all around. I'll also show you how to add the loop at the top and easily finish the end all in one go. I'm using the same fabric for the front and back. I'm cutting all my square pieces 8.5 inches, but you can make your pot holder any size. Cut one plain piece for the facing, and then cut one piece in the color for the heart. For the inner layers, you can use 2 pieces of 100% cotton batting, but I'm just going to use one. For the other layer, I'm using a piece of Insul-Bright, which is a heat-reflective batting. For the binding, I'm cutting a 2¼ inch strip across the width of the fabric. Trim away the selvages and open up the strip. With wrong sides together, fold in half, matching the edges, and press along the entire length. Open up again and fold in the outer edges to the center, leaving an 1/8 inch gap between them. Print out or draw a heart shape in the size that you want and cut it out. This one I have here is 5.5 inches wide. With wrong sides together, fold the facing piece in half vertically and crease to mark the center. Open up, center the heart pattern on top, and carefully trace around. I'm using a heat erasable pen. With right sides together, place the facing on top of the front piece. Pin close to the heart on all 4 sides if you need to. I'm using the Juki TL2010Q sewing machine. The link for this and the tools I use are down in the description below. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, click the link for Echidna Sewing and Juki Junkies for North America. Stitch along the heart shape, pivoting at the corners. If you have trouble sewing curves, sew a couple of stitches at a time. Stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot, and pivot the fabric to follow the curve. There's no need to do any back stitching, just overlap about 1/2 inch to finish the stitch line. Once done, remove the pins. I'm using my favorite Kai 6-inch embroidery scissors to cut the inner seam. Carefully trim down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the inside of the heart. From about the midpoint on each side, we need to cut notches close together along the seam across the top of the heart. Cut the notches about 1/8 inch apart as close as possible to the stitch line, being careful not to cut the stitches. Cut across the point and trim on each side. You can also use pinking shears to cut close to the stitch line. Along the bottom, just cut the notches about every 1/2 inch and right into the bottom point. At the top, carefully push out the point to the right side using a point turner or a knitting needle. Turn over and pull the facing through the center opening so that the wrong sides are together. Match the outer edges and adjust the seam. Cutting all those notches close together allows the seam allowance to spread out evenly and smoothly so that the seam lies flat without puckering. Press the seam flat on both sides, making sure the facing isn't showing on the right side. Place the back piece with the print in the correct direction, then flip it wrong side up. Stack the batting on top, then the Insul-Bright, the color for the heart, and then the front piece with the cutout on top. Pull at each side of the top piece to match the edges, then clip the layers together all around. Also pin at the center top and sides of the heart. I'm now switching to a 1.5mm or 1/16 inch left compensating foot. There's a small groove on the left side to butt the edge of the fabric against. There's also 2 separate feet that are spring-loaded to work with different thicknesses. First, stitch a scrap piece of fabric to prevent any bird nesting, then pull out the thread a few inches. Start the edge stitching at the bottom of the heart. Lower the needle below the point with the edge of the fabric against the left side of the presser foot. Edge stitch all around, back stitching at the start and finish, and pivoting at the top point. If you're finding this video helpful, make sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on all notifications, and leave a comment below. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. You can also show your support by becoming a member. To keep all the layers together, stitch all around 1/4 inch from the edge. If you turn over to the back, you'll probably notice that the layers have shifted a bit. Place a ruler just to the right of the stitching and carefully trim all sides. We'll begin attaching the binding at this corner, starting on the back. With right sides together, open up the binding and place it on top, aligning the top and side edges. Place it under the presser foot and pull the binding taut. Instead of stitching right in the crease, stitch just to the right of it. Stitch down, keeping the binding pulled taut, and pivot at the next corner. This seam allowance measures 1/2 inch across. From this bottom edge, measure up the same amount, 1/2 inch. This is the point where you stop with the needle down, pivot, and stitch to the corner. Don't cut the thread, just pull out a couple of inches so you can turn the piece around. With the binding opened up flat, fold it up right against the diagonal stitching in the corner. The sides should be in a straight line with a 45-degree angle from the corner. The other edge of the binding should also be parallel with the side. Place your fingernail at the top edge of the fabric and fold the binding straight down, matching the edges on the side. This top fold should be straight across and even with the fabric. Again, there's no need to cut the thread, just start stitching again from the very edge, and you don't need to backstitch. Repeat these steps for the next 2 corners and then stop when you're about halfway down the last side. Fold over the start of the binding so that it just covers the stitch line, and then place the other end of the binding on top. Continue stitching to the edge of the potholder and backstitch. At the corners, lift the binding and fold over to the front. By starting the stitching right from the edge, it holds the fabric neatly inside to the left. This is also how we want to fold the corner on the front. For the hanging loop, fold the binding, measure across 4.5 inches from the edge of the potholder and cut. Fold the end down, crease, and cut it on a 45-degree angle. Fold the binding over to the front, just covering the stitch line, and clip in place. Pull the binding taut and fold right against the edge so it's nice and flat on the other side. Flatten the corner at the top and fold down the other side. You can see my edges at the bottom don't match up. You'll just have to open up again, pinch the corner, and adjust until they do. Again, we want the corner fabric folded in to the left so that they're facing in the opposite direction on each side. This way, there's less bulk at the corner. Clip in place and continue all around. At the top, match the folded edges of the binding together and clip in place. Double check the binding is covering the stitching at that corner. Starting at the raw end, sew the folded edges of the binding together with a 1/16 inch edge stitch. Stitch until you're just past the edge of the potholder. Without any twisting, bring the end around, keeping the raw edge straight and parallel with the binding. Tuck the raw edge straight in under the binding, then push the stitched edge of the binding right against the bottom edge of the binding at the top. Continue stitching the binding all around, pivoting at the corners. When you're back at the corner, flatten the loop and stitch on top. Backstitch at this folded edge to reinforce the loop, and then backstitch where all the stitching meets. So it looks neater, don't stitch across the binding at the top. Flip the loop in and it's ready for use or to give as a thoughtful handmade gift. Be sure to check out some of my other tutorials. Thanks again for watching, take care, and happy sewing!